They found them still strapped in their seats, blood at their ears and noses, skin mottled blue. Dead in the capsule that had landed perfectly. June 30th, 1971. The Soviet Union was preparing to welcome back its latest heroes, Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev had just shattered every space endurance record, spending 23 days aboard Salyut-1, the world's first space station. They'd lived and worked in orbit longer than anyone before them, conducting over 140 experiments, broadcasting from space into Soviet living rooms each night. The recovery helicopters spotted the Soyuz-11 descent capsule exactly where it should be, parachute billowing above Kazakhstan. A textbook landing. The rescue crews rushed forward, grinning, ready to help the heroes from their seats. They knocked on the hull. Silence. They knocked again. Nothing. When they opened the hatch, the celebration died in their throats. All three men were dead, blue splotches covering their faces. They tried CPR. Nothing. Dobrovolsky's body was still warm, but it was too late. It had been too late for nearly half an hour. "25 minutes before touchdown, during module separation at 95 miles altitude, radio contact had ceased abruptly, well before the normal blackout caused by re-entry plasma. Mission Control assumed it was routine. They were wrong. When the orbital module separated from the descent capsule, 12 explosive bolts and 6 pyrotechnic cartridges fired simultaneously instead of sequentially. Think of it like slamming a door versus closing it gently. That shockwave, lasting maybe a second, jarred loose a ball joint in a ventilation valve, forcing it open and rupturing its seal. The valve sat beneath the cosmonauts' couches. It was meant to open at 2.5 miles altitude to equalize cabin pressure with the outside air for landing. Instead, it opened at 95 miles, where outside meant the vacuum of space. Here's the thing people get wrong about space exposure, probably from every science fiction movie you've ever seen. You don't explode. You don't freeze instantly. You suffocate. Fast. Within 40 seconds of pressure loss, the cosmonaut wearing biomedical sensors was dead. Within 110 seconds, all three were gone. By 935 seconds after the retrofire, cabin pressure reached 0. Based on their body positions, investigators determined Dobrovolsky and Volkov had unstrapped and were searching for the leak, their heart rates soaring. Patsayev's body was found near the valve. He may have been trying to close it when he lost consciousness. They probably realized the problem was the ventilation valve, but in the fog that filled the cabin after depressurization, amid severe pain from acute decompression sickness and rapid hearing loss, they closed the wrong valve, and there was no time to correct that mistake. Later, cosmonauts Alexei Leonov and Nikolai Rukavishnikov tried an experiment. It took them 52 seconds to manually close the ventilation valve under normal conditions, already knowing what to do. In a cabin filling with fog, bodies screaming in pain, air roaring out? Impossible. The Soyuz-11 crew had virtually no chance. Now we get to the part where we assign blame. And here, the story gets complicated. The crew wasn't wearing pressure suits. Why? Because there wasn't room. The original Soyuz design accommodated 2 cosmonauts in suits, but chief designer Vasily Mishin, who'd inherited the Soviet space program after the legendary Sergei Korolev died in 1966, backed the decision to fly a 3-man crew without pressure suits rather than a 2-man crew with suits to Salyut-1. 3 cosmonauts meant more work could be done. It meant better propaganda. It meant keeping pace with America. Many astronauts and engineers considered this decision fundamentally flawed and repeatedly demanded a review. Mishin once stated that those raising concerns were overcautious and that depressurization of the Soyuz spacecraft was impossible in principle. It's easy to point fingers at Mishin, and many did. Yuri Gagarin and Alexei Leonov had criticized Mishin's poor knowledge of the Soyuz spacecraft and the details of its operation, his lack of cooperation in working with the cosmonauts, calling him hesitant, uninspiring, poor at making decisions, over-reluctant to take risks, and bad at managing the cosmonaut corps. Under Mishin's leadership, 4 Soviet cosmonauts died in 2 separate tragedies, something that had never happened before under Korolev. But Mishin wasn't working in a vacuum either, politically speaking. The Soviet space program was hemorrhaging from the moon race loss. Every decision was pressured by the Central Committee, by deadlines, by the desperate need to prove Soviet space superiority after Apollo 11. The system demanded results. Corners got cut. There's another wrinkle. Alexei Leonov had advised the Soyuz-11 crew before flight to manually close the valves between the orbital and descent modules, not trusting them to shut automatically. It was a procedure he'd developed during hours in the simulator. The crew apparently didn't follow his advice. They stuck to their official training instead. Who's to blame? The designer who said depressurization was impossible? The system that demanded 3 cosmonauts instead of 2? The crew who followed procedure instead of a colleague's hunch? To this day, it's believed the Soyuz-11 crew perished due to a coincidental combination of several unlikely factors: the simultaneous pyrotechnic firing, the jarred ball joint, the timing, the valve design. Sometimes there's no villain. Sometimes it's just physics and probability, colliding in the worst possible way. The national outpouring of grief reportedly matched U.S. sorrow following President Kennedy's assassination in 1963. People wept openly in the streets for 3 men who for over 3 weeks had appeared nightly on their television screens. Premier Leonid Brezhnev, stone-faced at every state function, wiped away tears at their coffins. NASA astronaut Thomas Stafford represented President Richard Nixon at the state funeral, where the Soviets asked him to be one of the pallbearers. Think about that. At the height of the Cold War, an American astronaut carried the coffin of a Soviet cosmonaut. Space was starting to transcend politics. But behind closed doors, panic set in both countries. NASA astronauts and managers wondered if exposure to the space environment for 3 weeks had caused the deaths. Deke Slayton remembered that cosmonauts from an earlier 18-day mission could barely stand after landing. Was there something about being weightless that long that could kill you? America's Skylab program, planning even longer missions, was suddenly in doubt. The Soviets kept the true cause secret for more than 2 years. Not until October 1973 did the Washington Post finally report that the valve was to blame. In the meantime, Western experts speculated wildly. Was it physiology? Toxic fumes? The uncertainty was almost worse than the tragedy. When decompression and lack of proper spacesuits were blamed, NASA immediately made changes to the Apollo 15 lunar mission, scheduled to launch weeks later in July 1971. Astronauts Dave Scott and Jim Irwin would wear their spacesuits during ascent from the lunar surface, something not originally planned. NASA conducted a comprehensive reevaluation of windows, hatches, valves, fittings, and wiring in both the lunar and command modules. They studied cabin pressure decay from various sized holes, suit donning times, even re-entry with a completely failed window. The calamity of Soyuz-11 shook both superpowers to the core. Soviet investigators completed their report by early August 1971, with 10 subcommittees examining every aspect of the spacecraft. The recommendations were clear. Valves needed to be more stable against shock loads. Quick-action manual chokes had to be added, and pressure suits must be worn during all phases where depressurization was possible. The Sokol K, Space Falcon's suit was developed as a lightweight garment individually tailored for each cosmonaut and compatible with the Soyuz seat liners. A prototype was completed within weeks of the disaster. By spring 1972, it had been fully tested and approved. But here's the bitter engineering truth. The Soyuz spacecraft was extensively redesigned after the incident to carry only 2 cosmonauts because the extra room was needed for crew to wear spacesuits during launch and landing. A Soyuz capsule wouldn't hold 3 cosmonauts again until the Soyuz-T redesign in 1980, which freed enough space for 3 in lightweight pressure suits. If they'd worn suits, they would have lived. That's the cruelest part. The physicians had concluded that if Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev had been provided with spacesuits, they would have survived. The automatic landing system worked perfectly. The capsule was undamaged. They died in a perfectly functioning spacecraft from a problem that should have been survivable. Since 1971, no other cosmonaut has lost their life through decompression of their spacecraft. The Sokol suit and its descendants have flown on every Soyuz launch and landing since. Every single one. In August 1971, Apollo 15 astronauts David Scott and James Irwin deployed a plaque on the Moon at the Hadley-Apennine landing site, dedicated to fallen astronauts and cosmonauts, including Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev. Their names rest on the lunar surface alongside American astronauts who died in the Apollo 1 fire. Before America would commit to the Apollo-Soyuz test project, the 1975 handshake in space, they needed answers about Soyuz 11. The cooperation that flight represented, the joint docking, the shared meals in orbit between former rivals, that détente was built partly on the transparency that eventually emerged from this tragedy. Both Leonov and Kubasov, who'd been scheduled to fly Soyuz 11 as the prime crew before being grounded by a suspected tuberculosis diagnosis, which turned out to be a pollen allergy, flew the Soviet side of Apollo-Soyuz. Leonov shook hands with American astronaut Tom Stafford through the docking tunnel, the same Stafford who'd carried his colleagues' coffins 4 years earlier. From that shared experience, Stafford and Leonov developed a lifelong friendship. The Soyuz spacecraft, redesigned and hardened by this disaster, became the workhorse of human spaceflight. It's still flying today, the longest-serving spacecraft in history. Every mission to the International Space Station, every crew rotation, relies on technology refined in the shadow of those 3 silent men. Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev remain the only humans to have died in space, beyond Earth's atmosphere, in the actual void. The Apollo 1 crew died on the pad. The Challenger and Columbia crews died during launch and re-entry, technically still within atmosphere. These 3 Soviet cosmonauts? They died where no human had died before. In the profound silence 150 kilometers above Earth, where sound cannot travel because there's nothing to carry it. They died doing something no one had done before, proving humans could live and work in space for weeks at a time. Their 23-day mission stood as the space endurance record until Skylab 2 in 1973. They were pioneers who paid the ultimate price for a valve that opened 10 minutes too soon. Space doesn't forgive. It doesn't give second chances. It's not hostile, it's indifferent, which is somehow worse. And every time we send humans beyond Earth's protective embrace, we're gambling that every valve, every seal, every backup system will work exactly as designed. Most of the time they do. But when they don't, we learn. We redesign. We add redundancy. We remember 3 men who died in perfect silence, who showed us that the difference between triumph and tragedy in space can be measured in seconds, and in the thickness of a pressure suit we chose not to wear. You're the kind of person who doesn't just want the headlines. You want the real story, the human cost, the engineering truth. Subscribe to join a community that looks beyond the myths and into the extraordinary reality of space exploration.